Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Thursday. Well, it's my afternoon, but for some of you it may be early morning or midday. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm really excited to welcome you today to our webinar about moving with the momentum, discussing what has happened in the groundwater community in 2014, last year, and what are some key upcoming things that we can expect to see, and hopefully today think of some contributions for 2015. So I'm going to keep my very opening remarks short because we're going to have an official introduction from Dr. Aureli from UNESCO-IHP. So we're going to go ahead and get started with that, give her the privilege of being presenter. And yes, again, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to your participation.
Thank you, Kirstin. Thank you very much for starting this quite challenging webinar on a topic that is definitely at the frontier of the UN interest and studies and research. It's my pleasure to welcome all the participants to this debate and discussion. I would like to say that the UNESCO-IHP initiated very soon in the early 80s studies on international waters, and amongst the programs who have really provided an important contributions on transboundary waters studies can be listed two UNESCO programs. One is the PCP program on how to learn how to negotiate for water cooperations and resolutions of conflicts and preventions of conflicts, and the other one is the ISARM program on transboundary aquifers. In the year 2014, the main accomplishment, definitely, let's say, the work that we have started in assessing 166 transboundary aquifers and its aquifer system. But at the same time, this is based on what we have achieved in the international law community, and the fact that the draft articles on the law of transboundary aquifers are now contained as provisions in the UNEC Water Convention. This is really a breakthrough event in the past years. And again, the ratifications of the UN Water Course Conventions last year. Again, the UNEC Water Convention that is now opening to all the UN member states. Regional assessment on transboundary aquifers, international river basing, and inventory and mapping. The last map that IGRAC has just published in 2014 on transboundary aquifers, with much more details available. And, well, 2015, 2016, see all the UN agencies looking at what will be the big, let's say, challenge for human solidarity after the 2015 on, as we hope, water, with the water goal on the plate. Debates will be taken at the World Water Forum in April, all during the UNESCO events, seminars, and workshops. And the debate will be September 2015 with member states. In February this year, there will be a second meeting for the preparation of the ministerial declaration of the World Water Forum. Is always hosted here by UNESCO. And, well, we are working now on real hydro diplomacy in action, so with the Global Environment Facility as a main partner, in order to work on the ground with member states on how to create coordinations and consultation through member states for the assessment, study, and management and governance of international river basins and groundwater resources. Having said that, I think, Kirstin, I give you again the command, and I will listen carefully at the speakers and the interventions. Thank you so much for giving this opportunity to all of us to share about this important topic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Aureli. I appreciate your introduction, and for the participants, you'll notice that Aureli also prepared some slides, although she did a wonderful job without them. I think very few of us could present so well without our slides aiding us, but I think this will actually serve as a great tool for the future if you want to look back and refer to the plans of UNESCO-IHP for 2015. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit more in detail about what you can expect for today. And so I will bring you into full screen for the presentation, and hopefully I can get some help switching the video from Aureli to myself. I'll go ahead and look for that. Okay, great. Yeah, okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and move to my first page of the presentation. So, as you know, we have kind of an ambitious agenda for today. We're going to look at 3 main topics and review very quickly, 10 minutes each. We call it rapid fire. These topics from the perspective of what happened in 2014 and what will happen in 2015. And this is all going to occur. These presentations are going to occur under the umbrella of the IWLearn Groundwater Community of Practice. So I thought it would be very good if today we just took 5 or so minutes to get a better understanding of what's happening in this community of practice. For those of you who haven't heard of it, how you can get familiar with it and how you can participate in it, because what we want is to have this community of practice grow and include people from all over the world, your thoughts, your inputs, and ideas, and especially be able to apply those things to ongoing projects in the Global Environment Facility International Waters area. So let's get started. So, yeah, I just gave an overview of that. My apologies. So, just to give a very, very brief overview of the Global Environment Facility, who you all may know better as GEF. GEF is a financial mechanism that unites 182 member governments with international institutions, NGOs, civil society, and the private sector. And they're all aiming to deal with global environmental issues. And there are actually 5 components to the GEF program, one of which is international waters, which is where this webinar series and the Groundwater Community of Practice are operating today. So for more than 20 years, the GEF International Waters Program has generated an enormous amount of knowledge that is now being shared under this unique project called IWLearn, which of course is an acronym and stands for the International Waters Learning, Exchange, and Resource Network. So IWLearn is in its current phase is dealing with this groundwater COP and trying to grow it. And that's where we need you and your support today. So the idea is that the IW Learn project will strengthen transboundary water management by facilitating information and knowledge management exchange. So essentially, when these projects are in development, being executed, and also being reflected upon, everyone from around the world is getting a better understanding of, okay, great, what went well, how can we improve, what are new synergies that can be formed, and all of these things are really at the core of what IW Learn is going to accomplish. And in doing so, they provide an online platform, which is iwlearn.net, and there you can find kind of an inventory of the documents that have been developed, and they also have this IW Learn community of practice. So it's a term that I've already said a few times during my presentation, but it might be useful to define it. A community of practice is a group who can share common interests and desire to learn from and contribute to the community within their variety of experiences. So this is something that's really at the heart of what the IW Learn project seeks to accomplish. And it's also a way of having sustainability for the project, making sure that even though individual projects and activities that may be going on in the international waters focal area may come to a close, that the knowledge and the understandings that they generate continue on, either through individuals who have attained expertise in these areas or through these online and face-to-face exchanges. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So essentially, there are groundwater and surface water projects that are executed by national experts and policymakers in various areas related to water. And so when you talk about the COPs, or communities of practice, you will know that we don't just do this for the groundwater community, although that's what we're here for today. There is also a surface water COP, which is coordinated by IUCN, and I think there are other COPs emerging based on other focal areas, parts of the focal area of international waters. And so I'm just going to talk very briefly about the types of activities that have gone on under the groundwater COP so far, just to give you an idea of where this webinar series fits in today. So it's a bit of a crowded slide, but I want to get everything on there for you guys. So as I mentioned, there are face-to-face dialogues where people who have participated in these projects have a chance to share knowledge and experiences. And thus far, there have been 3 of these dialogues, one in Cape Town, one in Buenos Aires, and one in Athens. And they were very helpful and also are producing content for the groundwater portfolio analysis, which I will jump to in just a moment. And as a part of the face-to-face component is the integration dialogue, where experts meet, and the online component is the Global Groundwater Forum, which is the permanent home for the COP. And the emphasis on this Global Groundwater Forum is the sustainability aspect that I mentioned earlier. So making sure that this information and the relationships that are built and the information that is gathered actually have a place, one, where everyone can have access to it, and 2, where it kind of lives on beyond the lifespan of individual projects. So this online space is moderated by UNESCO-IHP and IGRAC, and you can have public discussions there, or if you want to have a private group dedicated to a specific issue, you can have private discussions as well. And yeah, it's a great place to share ideas. And all of the things that are generated from the face-to-face and the online components are contributed to the portfolio analysis, which is a living document. And it should say to be finalized and published in 2015, my mistake for the typo, but it's a living document, and it's a tool to present all the information that has been gathered in a synthesized way and in a way that is really easy to digest, accessible to everyone, and really in alignment with the goals of the IW Learn project. And something that's another attribute of this IW Learn project and the Groundwater COP that I really enjoy is our Groundwater Talks. So this is essentially a video series of experts talking about important topics to the groundwater community, how we can move these things forward. And so you'll see the series of Groundwater Talks online, and they're really excellent opportunities to put faces with names and to hear voices and to see what's really going on in the groundwater community. And I think this is something that's unique to the groundwater community. To my knowledge, the other COPs haven't delved into video yet, although I would love to see that and love to hear from their experts in the form of video. So that's the conclusion of this part of the presentation and just the general introduction to today. If you want more information, if you want to watch videos, if you want to check out the forum, if you want to see the outcomes of the integration dialogues, please go ahead and go to http://groundwatercop.iwlearn.net. Okay, thank you. And I'm having trouble changing my slides. Sorry, everyone. So thank you for that. And now you're going to listen to me again, but on a different topic. And I will explain a little bit about that in a moment. So today, our first overarching topic is the proposed Sustainable Development Goals and their relationship to groundwater. And this is something that is kind of the let's say the water theme of the year, and is really important to the global community and to the groundwater community. And we thought it would be just a starting point for today. And so we were hoping to have kind of an expert, someone who's worked behind the scenes on the Sustainable Development Goals, join us today. But it turns out everyone is at the UN Water Conference in Zaragoza, which is dealing specifically with this issue. So what I'm going to do as someone who has followed the process but is not necessarily an insider is just provide a very quick overview about where the Sustainable Development Goals are in their process, what the proposed text says, and what that could mean for groundwater. So I won't be taking too much time since I want to keep your attention and also give our presenters much more time to speak. So essentially what you see here is a diagram here, and it shows the timeline of where we are in the Sustainable Development Goals negotiation process. And if you look at where the arrow is, it's a little bit, the scale is a little bit deceiving, but we're, let's say, somewhere between halfway and 2/3 of the way through. And essentially what was happening in 2013 and 2014 was mainly consultation, proposing various sustainable development goals. I don't like this word, but for the sake of clarity, a bit of lobbying about what would go into the sustainable development goals, clustering different ideas and themes, and those sorts of things. And a lot of this was being done by the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, of course, with many inputs from civil society, from expert groups, from technical folks, etc. So that's where we are. And what has happened, you'll see, is that the Open Working Group in July of last year developed a formal proposal for what the Sustainable Development Goals should contain. And so where we are now is the UN General Assembly is in intergovernmental negotiations, which you'll see at the bottom of the diagram, and they are taking this Open Working Group proposal and deciding what is the final text going to look like, what attributes will be kept, what might be altered, and maybe in some cases what will be removed, although my understanding that that doesn't happen very often. So what I want to do today is focus on the water goal and what I can call the water goal, which is the proposed goal 6. And there were a lot of groups, including UNESCO-IHP, who were taking really, and also individual national governments, for example, the Swiss government, who were taking really huge steps during the open working group process to ensure that there was a dedicated individual goal for water. And so the goal as it stands now is to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. And there are some parts to this goal. I'm not going to read word for word, but I'm just going to highlight what they are. So equitable and universal access to safe drinking water, access to adequate and equitable hygiene for all, especially women and girls, improved water quality, an increase in water use efficiency, and a reduction in the number of people suffering from water scarcity, implementation of integrated water resources management through transboundary cooperation, the protecting and restoring water-related ecosystems, and expanding international cooperation and capacity building, and finally, supporting and strengthening participation of local communities. So you'll see in there a lot of attributes and, let's say, principles, if you will, that the international community feels are important for sustainable development, human development, inclusive development. Many of those terms you hear, they're related, although some divide them. And these things will ensure that the main focus is getting access to water, safe, clean drinking water, hygiene and sanitation, and doing so in a way that doesn't damage the actual resource. So that's kind of how I would characterize this, which is maybe how you would define sustainable development as it's related to water. So there are also some other goals, not just goal 6, that include water issues. So if you look at it's not a preamble, but let's say the introduction to the proposed goals, sustainable development goals, you'll see that it mentions a human right to water. There are also 8 other mentions, including ending epidemics linked with waterborne diseases, reducing death from water pollution, reducing death from water-related disasters, reducing the release of chemicals and waste into water, conserving and restoring and sustaining freshwater ecosystems, sustainably managing marine and coastal ecosystems, and reducing impacts of invasive species in aquatic ecosystems. So when you put all of those things together and then you reflect on them in the context of groundwater resources and the role that groundwater resources plays in all of these things, I chose to kind of display them in a 4-part schematic. So let's say the major kind of groups of issues were quantity, quality, risks, and governance. And of course, someone else might categorize these a bit differently, but just for the sake of our discussion today, I plan to frame it like this. So when we think about issues related to groundwater quantity, what are the attributes of the proposed sustainable development goals that are going to touch with that? So we have universal access, equitable allocation, sustainable use. So all of those relate to how much of the resource is being taken from the ground. Is it being taken from the ground in a sustainable way, or is it depleting the resource or perhaps polluting the resource? And also thinking about land use degradation issues that may reduce recharge or cause other sorts of problems. Things that were not explicitly mentioned in the goals but do have to do with sustainability are recharge, groundwater recharge and flow, and also one of the goals, 6A, which I won't go back and show again, but one of the goals, 6A, actually mentioned quite a few, let's say, technologies or interventions that can augment access and availability of water resources. But I noticed that managed aquifer recharge wasn't included in that. Rainwater harvesting was, and I feel like in some ways managed aquifer recharge is almost the groundwater counterpart. So it's something to consider moving forward, that maybe this is something that as the groundwater community we could try to contribute to these ongoing discussions. When looking at quality, of course, there's contamination issues, and those were very explicitly mentioned, but in terms of agriculture and industry. But contamination from improperly installed sanitation and hygiene facilities was not brought to the fore. And if we are talking about increasing access to those things, which I really hope we do, because there are still billions of people that do not have access to sanitation and hygiene, we also have to consider how we're providing that access and whether it may have negative impacts on our groundwater resources. And of course, another thing that was mentioned explicitly was public health concerns. So contamination with pollutants that have known health issues, that will cause known health issues. In terms of risks, mentioned throughout, again, droughts and floods, although issues of groundwater flooding were not mentioned, but I think that's probably okay, given the kind of the scope of the document. In terms of something that is maybe a good thing to consider discussing explicitly in the goals, though, is the numerous communities that are reliant upon groundwater resources that don't replenish. So essentially they're planning, hopefully planning, but in many cases not, how to use these resources in an equitable way over time so that as many generations as possible can gain access to these water resources. And I think that this is something that's really important in many parts of the world, but again, didn't get explicitly mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals. And when we go to governance, we think about integrated water resources management, public participation, capacity building, again, international cooperation, and the role of law. These were all mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is great, although I noticed they emphasized environmental law and didn't talk specifically about water law. Now, of course, maybe I'm parsing things out too much. Maybe they were saying that, okay, water law is under the umbrella of environmental law, but I do think, as you will hear later with the discussion of kind of the new developments in water law, that maybe it could be good to direct some explicit attention there. So that's kind of my overview of what's happening with groundwater in the SDGs. If my slide changes for me. The last issue is, what do we do now? Where do we go from here? And essentially, these proposed goals from the Open Working Group are going to be, quote unquote, the main basis for the post-2015 intergovernmental process. And when they say that, they mean the negotiations in the General Assembly. But of course, there's still opportunity to engage with the governments who are framing these goals and defining the targets. And so I think as a groundwater community, it would be really good if we develop strategic points of intervention in where we can discuss, the outcomes, as in the goals, the targets, the monitoring, but also look at how we can still remain active and engaged in the process. And so, yeah, I really invite you all later during the question and answer session and in our discussion to really think about what we can do to make sure that groundwater is really addressed in a complete and integrated way in the SDGs. So yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to pass the presenter role to Dr. Richard Taylor, where he's going to be talking about the Grow Futures project.
Thanks very much, Kirstin. I'm just waiting to see whether I can now manipulate the PowerPoint. Thanks very much for your description and discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals. It provides a very useful context to what I'm going to now speak about. And in light of this is looking at where we've been coming through 2014 and where we're going in 2015. A very important kind of contribution, particularly in the Sub-Saharan African context, is a new UK program, UK government program. I'm based here in London. And there's a new UK program funded by the UK government called Unlocking the Potential of Groundwater for the Poor. And this program is actually specific to the region of Sub-Saharan Africa. And after a lengthy review process, a number of projects, actually 5 consortium projects working across Sub-Saharan Africa will be starting now in early 2015. And many of them, well, probably most of them, will be actually helping to develop the evidence base and procedures that may help to better define and refine sustainable development goals in this region as they pertain to groundwater. I'm still unable to move the, or is that, no? Yes, if anyone can help me with moving forward on the PowerPoint, that would be very helpful. At the moment, I'm unable to. There we go. I now see that I can adjust that. That's wonderful. So there's a program called UPGROW, Unlocking the Potential of Groundwater in Africa, and this is a UK funded program, and as I said, there are 5 projects. And so what I'd like to do is kind of put a bit of a context here to you, and again, be speaking about the region of Sub-Saharan Africa. I'll be speaking about a specific project called Groundwater Futures in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in this we deliberately link groundwater and groundwater development to poverty alleviation. And you'll see by the, I hope that if you're looking at the PowerPoint now, you see the large range of organizations that are involved in this. Universities in the United Kingdom, but also institutions from France and the Netherlands working directly with universities and research institutions in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Niger, in Cameroon, and in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, Tanzania, and also in South Africa, working with organizations also, including IGRAC, who is here today, IRD in France, and of course the International Water Management Institute out of the office in Victoria. And the premise for this research is recognizing that in a warming world, there will be increased dependence on groundwater resources in light of groundwater being the largest distributed store of fresh water on the planet. And recent work that I was involved in and with the British Geological Survey, we identified the groundwater storage itself is about 10 to 100 times annual river flow. And in essence, use of groundwater in a warming world where river flow and rainfall become more variable, longer droughts, more intensive flood events, the development of distributed groundwater storage will be rather critical to improving access, sustainable and sustained access to safe water, and to improving livelihoods and food security. And these will largely be done through irrigation. And it will lead, this is the kind of key premise. But there are a number of questions, and really the motivation behind this UK government-funded program is we recognize that there are a lot of questions regarding this resource that remain essentially unanswered. For instance, the renewability of groundwater resources, the absolute total volume, although we've made some preliminary estimates, really our understanding of groundwater storage remains rather limited. Furthermore, many of you will know that groundwater itself is developed in a rather chaotic fashion, in that individuals can put down wells. It doesn't necessarily require a central government. So what we have is a tremendous amount of uncertainty about the renewability, the total volume, and really how much water is being used as we at this time, and in particular, what is the kind of magnitude of dependence that we might project upon groundwater into the future. When we get back to these sustainable development goals, actually a major question, particularly for groundwater resources, is over what time scale people define sustainability. To take an example, in semi-arid regions, you may find that aquifers are replenished once or twice a decade. In essence, any groundwater development in those regions will necessarily be unsustainable on a kind of over a few years, but then actually replenishment taking place maybe every once or twice a decade may actually replenish that aquifer after it has been depleted, say, for 3 or 4 years in succession. And so, unlike, say, rivers, groundwaters work on longer time frames, longer time lags between replenishment and groundwater storage. And so really, there remain some important questions regarding the resource and how we might define sustainability. Perhaps for aquifers, we might need to look more at decadal timescales rather than annual timescales. Just a suggestion. But again, the research program that I'm describing here is hoping to answer some of these questions. And of course, groundwater development is not just about the physical resource itself. One of the key things identified in the Sustainable Development Goals was the need for increased local participation of communities. And one of the things that under the project that we'll be running under this UpGrow program, this Groundwater Futures program, is trying to improve the participation of local communities. There tends to be, I think one of my social science colleagues tended to call them the motorways of highways and the bush paths, where kind of top-down government programs might be thought of as sort of highways where maybe intensive irrigation is being proposed. And really, is that what local people demand? Is that what local people are looking for? And it may be that there are alternative groundwater development pathways, maybe less intensive, more distributed, more localized, low-intensity use of groundwater. And really, we may not be aware of these sort of development trajectories or pathways, largely because the voices of people more locally, often poor local stakeholders, may be excluded from some of this discussion and some of these discussions around governments and developments more generally. And so the research that we are doing, and along with some other colleagues across this UK government program, is trying to develop a scientific basis and participatory management processes by which groundwater can be used sustainably for poverty alleviation in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we're proposing a 4-year program in which we try to make a much better understanding of replenishment of aquifers, the magnitude of groundwater that is stored, whether we are talking about small-scale, low-storage aquifers within, say, deeply weathered crystalline rocks, whether we're talking maybe about more substantial aquifers, groundwater resources within large regional sedimentary systems, be it sandstone or limestone, as we find in Zambia as an example. And actually trying to develop new tools for beginning to understand how do groundwater resources and groundwater storage vary under changing climates, land use, and critically under demand scenarios. So we'll be looking at part of this will be an analysis of existing data sets. You can see that in the lower left part of your screen at the moment, where we're trying to look at how do aquifers respond to these different changes over time. really better understanding the timescales of replenishment and the impacts of demand on groundwater storage. The central picture in your screen is the use of magnetic resonance sounding, a kind of new geophysical technique for helping to quantify groundwater storage. And on the bottom right, we're looking at the monitoring of groundwater levels. And this actually is in the Makutupora aquifer within central semi-arid Tanzania, which is one of the longest continuous records of groundwater levels in Sub-Saharan Africa, up to 60 years. And really taking this, if we call physical measurements, and better understanding the issues of really groundwater volume in particular, and what is this resource that we're talking about, and what are the potential poverty alleviation strategies that might be sustainable in the long run, employing groundwater. Again, trying to develop a kind of a framework by which groundwater might be governed, and in which the voices of poor people can be considered. And we look at a wider range of potential groundwater development pathways within these scenarios, rather than going down the kind of tried and pathways in a more top-down approach. Actually looking at how do local communities use groundwater, and how might those voices and opportunities be better consisted in a groundwater development and managed scenario, trying to look at using a number of different pathways and perspectives, including a groundwater development game, to try and get people to understand what the trade-offs might be between different groundwater development pathways, and actually letting people use their own criteria. This is this multi-criteria mapping to try and better understand which might be the best and most sustainable pathway, most equitable pathway for people in the long run. And so I hope I've given you a bit of a flavor of where a very cross-disciplinary research involving, and in fact this research will be taking place primarily in 3 zones: in West Africa and Niger and Nigeria, in East Africa and Ethiopia and Tanzania, involving different aquifer environments, different groundwater development scenarios, but all sharing a common goal of trying to use groundwater in a sustainable way. But as I said earlier in the presentation, exactly over what kind of time scale do we define sustainability? And really, what are the development objectives here? Is it a more kind of grassroots, localized, bottom-up development pathway? Or are we looking at, and again, it's not necessarily prioritizing one over the other, but considering both a kind of bottom-up grassroots approach as well with more top-down initiatives about trying to enhance and improve not only water and food security, and really looking at both of these and trying to understand in using the science to better understand the sustainability of these pathways, but also ensuring that the voices of as many people as possible are considered within the decision-making frameworks that decide or help decide what kind of development pathways may be undertaken. And I can see in many ways that this research will be taking place over the next 3 to 4 years, from 2015 to 2018, and could really make a big difference in trying to shape the sustainable development goals that by 2030. And so with that, I think I've definitely gone on long enough, but I'm happy to get questions at the end, and if anyone's happy to email through or get in touch with me to describe this in more detail. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Richard. That was a wonderful presentation and a great synopsis of what your project will be working towards in 2015. It obviously has some great tie-ins with the Sustainable Development Goals, especially I saw in your last few slides a lot about participation, inclusivity, which are very much highlighted. So thank you for your contribution. A quick note about technical things before we move on into the next round of presenters. We're experiencing a bit of delay between when you see and hear the presenters and when the PowerPoint actually moves. So it's all working fine, just maybe a bit slower than your own reaction time. So just be patient with that and everything will be fine. So now I'd like to move us on to our second topic, which is developments in international law applicable to groundwater. I'll introduce all of our speakers on this topic at once, and they can just move through on their own without an intervention from me. So our first speaker is going to be Annika Luhonen from UNECE, or maybe I should expand that, the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, and she's going to be talking about the 2014 model provisions on groundwater, which Riche mentioned earlier. And then to bring us into 2015, we have a presentation on the draft articles on the law of transboundary aquifers from Professor Gabriel Epstein and Dr. Francesca Sindico. So that's going to be a joint presentation, which I'm sure you'll enjoy very much. So I'd like to go ahead and pass the presentation role to Annika, and we very much look forward to her contributions.
To the partners of the Groundwater Community of Practice for the kind invitation to share what's happening in the framework of the UNECE Water Convention regarding transboundary groundwaters. So just a very brief overview for those who are not familiar with this instrument. That the Convention on the Protection and Use of Transboundary Water Courses and International Lakes was signed in 1992 and entered into force in 1996. It was initially negotiated as a regional instrument for Europe in the large sense, extending to cover the Caucasus and Central Asia also. But wishing to share this experience that has been acquired in the past 20 years, the parties to the convention decided to amend it in 2003 to make it accessible to all UN member states. And since February last year, this amendment is in force. So this global opening is imminent. There is an institutional framework under the convention. I won't go into the details, but the main decision-making body is meeting of the parties every 3 years. There are also a range of subsidiary bodies, including the implementation committee, the integrated resource management working group, and secretariat. And a lot of soft law tools have been developed, guidance documents, in addition to there being two protocols to the convention also. And a number of projects are being carried out on the ground to support implementation and application of the convention and to strengthen transboundary cooperation. The convention applies to both surface waters and groundwaters as a very holistic approach. It's also linked to recipient seas. By definition, it covers transboundary waters that mark also are located in the boundaries between two or more states, and both groundwaters, transboundary groundwaters connected with surface water courses or not connected are included. In the framework of the convention, model provisions or model agreement on transboundary groundwaters have been developed. And this is non-binding guidance that the meeting of the parties in 2012 adopted. This is a joint effort of legal and technical experts from the international level, but also from the countries of the UNECE region. And notably UNESCO and the International Association of Hydrogeologists very actively participated in this work. And we build very heavily on this International Law Commission's draft articles, but in the context of the World Convention. And these are meant to be used by not only parties but also non-parties when entering into new agreements or reviewing perhaps existing agreements that either do not refer to groundwater or just wish to strengthen the application of groundwater. This could be used as model and then adapted as needed. And this publication, which came out earlier this year, includes extensive commentaries also with reference to also draft articles, Groundwater Talks Convention, and so on. And these are now available in English, French, Russian, and since today in Arabic also. Just briefly about the scope, there are 9 provisions. The first one basically just restates the 2 general principles of international water law. It is to prevent, control, and reduce any transboundary impact and equitable and reasonable use, taking into account all relevant factors. Then the second provision refers to obligation of sustainable use with a view to maximizing long-term benefits from the use of the groundwater resource, and refers to sustainability and necessity to take into account the rate of replenishment of groundwater, the amount available, the functions that it has, and so on. And the third provision is about cooperation in the identification, delineation, and characterization of the transboundary groundwater resource. And there's also an obligation to establish programs on monitoring and assessment, joint coordinated programs. And the fourth provision refers to integrated management of surface and groundwaters. Of course, groundwaters have their particularity, but it's important to sort of build on the specificities of all the resources. The fifth provision is about prevention, control, and reduction of pollution, and it recalls that the precautionary principle makes reference to specific importance of drinking water, and also mentions some concrete measures like establishment of protection zones, regulation of land uses, and so on. Provision 6, it's about exchange of information and data. And number 7 is on joint or coordinated management plans, and these shall provide for inter alia water allocation, authorization of abstraction, pumping limitations, just to mention a few. Then provision 8 states that all planned activities likely to have a significant effect on transboundary groundwater and thereby an adverse impact on another party shall be subject to environmental impact assessment. And UNECE has also another instrument, the so-called convention on this specific aspect. And this provision draws on the Aarhus Convention, also as there's a mention that measures shall be adopted aimed at raising awareness and provide access to information and public participation and reproductive justice and public participation. And provision 9 is about joint institutions to implement this kind of agreements on transparent groundwater. Just to underline the importance, why in the current state of affairs it's really important to strengthen transboundary groundwater in management of transboundary groundwater. A lot of bilateral and multilateral agreements in Eastern Europe, Caucasus and Central Asia, either they don't make explicit reference to groundwater, or in practice the application to groundwater remains very low. Also, joint institutions for transboundary water operation, they commonly do not deal with groundwaters. There are some exceptions. There's the Danube Basin, where under ICPR there's a working on groundwater. The bilateral commission between Russia and Russian Federation and Estonia also includes groundwater monitoring cooperation, but these are rather exceptions. So there's need to promote integrated approach to managing surface waters and groundwaters more. And then in our region, pan-European region, there's the complication that we're dealing with different concepts. Groundwater bodies as management units according to the Water Framework Directive, and then aquifers as a hydrogeological technical term. And this underlines that it's necessary to adapt agreements on transboundary groundwaters to the particular legal and physical setting, also the current uses and the Just a few words about the value of UNEC Water Convention in managing transboundary groundwater. It's already a platform for cooperation and sharing experience for some 40 parties. And we also experience increased participation from outside by Europe. And so far, in one way or the other, we've engaged with some 60 countries outside the region in some way through participation in events or in other ways. So during this more than 20 years, a lot of experience has been acquired, commission has started, development of transboundary agreements, establishment of joint bodies, and so on, both on technical and political tracks. The functioning institution structure has evolved according to the tasks at hand, the demands from the countries. That, for example, when monitoring guidelines were developed for transboundary groundwaters, then there was a groundwater task force that was also operational, and then these legal provisions, core group on groundwater was set up under the legal board. So there needs to be work on groundwater emerge. It's possible to respond in this framework. And also I should note that regional assessment of transboundary groundwaters, including aquifers and groundwater bodies, have also inspired similar exercises in other regions. So future outlook, a few points about this year and what is ongoing. So to respond to this insufficient attention to groundwater in existing agreements, there's definitely it needs to review agreements, also from the point of view of conjunctive management, analyze, revise, and in the course of this year, especially now in the coming months, the program of work, the draft program of work for the period from 2016 to 2018 will be prepared under the convention, and it is expected that an integral part of it will be legal technical assistance related to developing or revising agreements, also related to transboundary groundwaters if appropriate. And the model provisions, they are a resource that synthesize a lot of both legal and technical experience about managing transboundary groundwaters. So I very much invite that the countries would make use of this in their particular context, and piloting would be very welcome. It is also possible that in the next 3-year period there would be more emphasis on water scarcity issues and water allocation. And obviously groundwater is very important here, since there are a lot of countries that heavily depend on this resource. And also it is expected that some preliminary steps will be taken related to next comprehensive assessment of transboundary waters. There's an obligation under the Convention to regularly carry out coordinated joint assessments of transboundary waters, and geographical scope will be up for discussion. And we have a memorandum of understanding with UNESCO, and a specifically important part of it is cooperation related to transboundary groundwaters, and we foresee some awareness raising and capacity building events building on this very good cooperation. And now with the global opening, there will be more opportunities to share and also learn from experience in other regions of the world and managing transboundary groundwaters. And related to the SDGs, UNECE has a very active role. For example, we led the thematic consultation stream on water resource management for this past 2015 development agenda. And with the framework of UN and water, we continue contributing to the task team on integrated water resources management. And the transboundary dimension is just referred to in the post SDGs, the water goal, and will continue contributing to that process. And even when groundwater is not explicitly mentioned, it's implicitly there. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anuka. We're going to go ahead and move straight into the presentations from Gabriel and Francesco.
Well, thank you, Kirstin. This is Gabriel Eckstein. Francesco and I will be talking about specifically the draft articles on transboundary, on the wild transboundary aquifers that were adopted by the UN International Law Commission, transferred to the UN General Assembly, and now are in front of the General Assembly, and in terms of they're being considered. This is a topic that Francesco and I have been working on for quite a number of years independently, and we collaborated recently on an article on the current status of the draft articles. We wanted to see where they were, where they were going, and so this is going to be part of this presentation. First of all, I just want to lay a little bit of groundwork in terms of the relevance of groundwater and maybe specifically transboundary aquifers, because there is a justification for why we need these draft articles and other normative legal mechanisms developed. And I'm going to run through these very quickly, because most of these, I'm sure you know, something around 45% of humanity relies on groundwater resources for the basic daily needs. We don't quite know how many rely on transboundary aquifers globally, but what we do know is that in river basins that are transboundary, somewhere around 40 to 50% of humanity resides in these transboundary river basins, and most of these river basins have transboundary aquifers related to them. We also know that there are around 275 or 276 transboundary rivers and lakes globally. What we're learning right now, and at the time we wrote the article, IGRAC had categorized somewhere around 450 transboundary aquifers or aquifer bodies, and I believe the number is now over 600 since we published the article. So we're finding there's a significantly larger number of transboundary aquifers globally, more also the more transboundary rivers and lakes, and people rely on these. They rely on them for their daily needs, and they rely on them for their livelihoods. In contrast, we have thousands, literally thousands of agreements, treaties, arrangements on transboundary rivers and lakes, but only one that is on a transboundary aquifer, one that is a management regime that's on the Genovese aquifer. We have a couple in Northern Africa that are data sharing agreements. We have groundwater mentioned in a number of agreements like the water need that has not yet been implemented, and some other mechanisms, but that's really it. And so while we have more transboundary aquifers and we have transboundary rivers and lakes, we have a tremendous shortage and a need for governance. So in the 1970s, early 1970s, the UN International Law Commission began looking at this topic of transboundary waters. 1997, the UN Watercourses Convention was adopted. It was just went into force this past August for the countries that have ratified it, 35 nations. Now the Palestinian Authority recently signed on to it too. And it does apply to some transboundary aquifers, but this is where we start having a discussion about, well, what aquifers are subject to the convention, UN Watercourses Conventions, and which ones are not. Because of this question, the UN requested that the UN International Law Commission address this gap. And in 2002, assigned the UN ILC with this new mandate. They assigned Ambassador Chusei Yamada of Japan as special rapporteur for this. And by 2008, they transmitted 19, the UN ILC transmitted 19 draft articles to the UN General Assembly. I'm not going to go into the details of the draft articles. What I do want to focus on is where they're going, and then Francesca is going to pick up on this a little bit further. As you see on the slide, in 2008, the UN General Assembly commended them to the attention of governments and suggested that governments around the world take these into account as they develop relations over transboundary aquifers with their neighbors. They did the same thing in 2011. It was put on the agenda of the General Assembly in 2011, and they did essentially the same thing. In 2013, they changed the language, and both Francesco and I thought this was fairly significant because not only did they commend them to the attention of governments, but they suggested that rather than taking into account that governments should use these as guidance for the development of arrangements, treaties, and so on with their riparian aquifer states. And this is an important change because it takes it from the level of recommending to nations that they look at this document and consider it, to actually suggesting that they use it as guidance. And this is a pretty significant change, we believe, in terms of where this instrument may be going. So I think at this point, I'm going to transfer this over to Francesca to continue.